And you are live.
Aloha. My name is Poka HAWAI'I. I'm also known as Hayden Burgess, and I am an advocate for human rights. And in this particular case, specifically with regards to the right to self determination as it applies to Hawaii. The question has been asked: what are the plans for bringing an action to bring about the eventual decolonization of Hawaii? And in order to jump into the question, I need to establish some preliminary stages or understanding of what is Hawaii, because normally the idea is that Hawaii is part of the United States, is supposed to be the 50th state of the United States. But the question is, how did we get to that position? And it's very important that people understand that prior to 1893, Hawaii had been recognized in the international community as an independent nation. We had treaties and executive agreements with almost every nation that existed in the world. We had 5 treaties with the United States of America. We had treaties with Britain, with France, with even Japan. We had our head of state, the first head of state ever to circumnavigate the world, and he was accepted in every court that he went to. So there was no question about it. Hawaii had been an independent nation, recognized by other nations as an independent nation. We were a member of the Universal Postal Union, one of the first international organizations. And had there been a United Nations at that time, we would certainly have been a member of the United Nations. So, what happens when, on one hand, you understand that you had a nation that was in existence, that was independence, and in fact, it had a particular character about it. One of the characters was that, let's say, back in 1840, 1839, you may be familiar with this movie called the Amistad or Amistad, in which discovery of a slave ship or a ship of blacks, uncertain if they were slave or free because of the accident of where they were born, coming into, I think it was North Carolina. So that question had to go all the way up to the Supreme Court. Are they free or slave, depending on where they originated from? Well, Hawaii had already a law that there would be no such thing as slavery in Hawaii. In fact, our Constitution said, whereas God hath created all men of all nations of all stature equal before the law. We were a very civilized people in which we stood for these principles of human rights and fundamental freedoms built into our Constitution while the Americans were still fighting a war about the freedom and the liberation of all peoples. So Hawaii was, in fact, a very progressive nation. In 1893, we had electricity and telephone in our capital, Iolani Palace, before the White House had it in theirs. We had streetcars and street lights and electricity on our streets. Hawaii had been recognized as the most literate nation in the world. The second nation that compared to Hawaii was not the United States of America, it was Switzerland. So we were a very advanced nation. Our reputation was very high in the international society. And I can go on and on about these matters. For many people, if you look at just a legal issue today, they are not too concerned about the qualities of Hawaii that I speak of now. But in terms of getting people of Hawaii to understand that we should be proud, that our history carries with us a promise of what we can be, rather than being taken over by another people and substituting our whole history. Things that I'm talking about now, we had never understood. When I went through elementary school, high school, I had never understood that history until I graduated even after graduating from the University of Hawaii with a political science degree. That was never taught to us. Only when I was in the U.S. military did I just by chance pick up a book written by Queen Liliuokalani in about 1900, a book that was never republished in Hawaii until 1963, 64, out of Japan, out of Tuttle Press. And I happened to come across it in the library of Hickam Air Force Base, of all places, where I started discovering this history. And it is only through that history that I was able to appreciate more fully what the possibilities, what the promise had been. Imagine that, an independent nation with its own identity, with such a great promise, today simply mimicking the ways of another people whose culture was very limited, less than 200 years old, when we follow from a culture of 1,000 years before that. And not only that, but Hawaii now had the influx of cultures of many different people all over the world. And instead, we were substituted only for the American culture. So a cultural influence is also a driving force, not only the historical legalities and illegalities, but to have the people understand that the whole character is also dependent, or there's a lot of quality in the character to bring them towards independence. It's not only the legalistic issue, but it's an issue of character, it's an issue of purpose, it's an issue of direction. So I say that as a preliminary to what has happened in Hawaii. The United States conducted a sneak attack on January 16, 1893, landed 162 U.S. Marines. And they were blue jackets, they weren't called Marines. And essentially, they overthrew the government. They forced Queen Liliuokalani, who at that time were at peace with the United States. We had 5 treaties and executive agreements with the United States. A treaty of 1839, 1840, it said there shall be perpetual peace and amity between our people and the people of the United States. And yet, in 1893, 50 years later, they attacked and took over our government. Changed the government, but they did it in a very manipulative way. They didn't come in and just take over the government. They created a puppet government called the Provisional Government of the United States. The plan was take over the government, have the Queen or force the Queen to resign. The Queen then says, I yield to the United States of America until an investigation is conducted and the life of the land is returned back to the Hawaiian people. So rather than the United States taking action now, they have this provisional government made up of mostly American businessmen saying, we accept the yielding of the Queen, they call it a surrender, and say that we shall govern Hawaii and we shall immediately submit a treaty of annexation to the United States of America. President of the United States at that time was William Harrison. The Queen had been very good friends with President with President Cleveland, who had been the president prior to Harrison. Now, Cleveland gets out of office, loses the election to Harrison. Harrison comes in, Cleveland is out of office. The Queen and Cleveland are very good friends. But Cleveland is elected. As of January, when the Americans have landed and invaded, Cleveland was already determined to be the president, but he won't get sworn in until, I think it was in April. At that time, that's when presidents were sworn in. So Harrison has this very brief period of time in which he can try to submit the United States or submit Hawaii to the United States in a treaty of annexation. So they rush a treaty off to the United States, sign it, send it to the U.S. Senate for ratification. Why to the U.S. Senate? Because Article 2, I think it's Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution, it requires that every treaty must be approved by two-thirds of those present in the U.S. Senate. They cannot get two-thirds present. Cleveland then gets into office. He sends an investigator to Hawaii. The investigator, called Blount, Minister Blount, comes to Hawaii, investigates, reports to Cleveland that almost to the man, no one supports annexation of Hawaii to the United States. Cleveland says, as long as I am President of the United States, I will never resubmit the Treaty of Annexation back to the U.S. Senate. I will not accept Hawaii. But Cleveland is facing a split Congress. He's not able to restore the life of the nation because the Congress will not support him. So he does nothing. The people in Hawaii then converts themselves, or the provisional government converts itself to a new government, because a lot of people are accusing them of not being a legitimate government. They are not supported by the people. They don't even have a constitution. How can you have a provisional government submitting a territory to the United States? So this is what they do. They must change their clothing. They must get legitimacy. So this government now claims, okay, we shall have an election. We shall have a constitutional convention. We shall elect delegates to the constitutional convention. And the president of the provisional government, Sanford Dole, does the name sound familiar? Well, it's a long history in Hawaii. He decides that he shall appoint 19 of the 37 delegates to the convention. And of course, they're all supportive of the provisional government. The other 18 will be elected by the people. But to be sure that the Queen's supporters do not get in, you have to swear an allegiance to the provisional government and disavow any loyalty to Queen Liliuokalani before you can even vote. So now they were going to show the Hawaiian people how American democracy works.
Right on.
They voted for these people. They elected their delegates. They held the Constitutional Convention, and they eventually came out with a constitution that appointed Sanford Dole as a president of the new government, the Republic of Hawaii. The Republic of Hawaii, in its constitution, says that the Republic shall own all of the lands of Hawaii that was owned by the government. All of the waters of Hawaii is owned by the Republic. All of the people of Hawaii are now owned by the Republic of Hawaii. No vote taken. How can you have an adoption or an amendment of the Constitution without asking for the consent of the people? It was a sham. They held on to the government until Cleveland gets out of office. New president comes in, McKinley, Republican president. As soon as he comes in, they send another treaty to the Senate. The Senate still remembers what had happened in the investigation by Minister Blount. They refused to pass the treaty. So out of the House of Representatives, they have a resolution, a joint resolution of Congress. Essentially what they're saying is this: although we cannot get one house to approve the treaty as required by the Constitution, suppose we have both houses accepted just by a mere majority of both houses, and in that way we can circumvent the United States Constitution. And so they adopted a joint resolution of Congress accepting Hawaii as a part of the United States. Hawaii now is considered a territory of the United States. The United States comes in, changes a law, creates a new system of government called a territorial system. The president appoints the governor. All judges in Hawaii are appointed by the president. Essentially, the Americans have now taken over.
What year was this?
This is in 1900, okay, the Organic Act. So Hawaii is controlled by the United States. They move in, the language changes, and we are forbidden to speak our own language even at our Hawaiian schools. Okay? All jobs are controlled by either the Republican Party, the U.S. military, or what they call the Big Five. Five major corporations that trace all of their history back to the original missionary party in Hawaii. So now you have this oligarchy. So previously, we had a very elitist government with our kings and our kahunas and a very stratified society. But when King Kamehameha III wrote this constitution talking about the equality of all people, Hawaii began to change to an egalitarian government so that people could actually become participants, so that by the time the Americans landed, Queen Liliuokalani had in her book, she says, our belief is that the voice of God is a voice of the people. So it's the movement from the elitist position to the egalitarian position. Now the Americans move in and they create an oligarchy, a substitute, another elitist program. And so Hawaii is controlled by this elitist program from 1900 until 1954. There's a Second World War, there's a First World War, there's revolution in terms of labor unions. And so finally, a Democratic Party takes over, overcomes the Republican Party. And then in 1959, we all heard about this so-called statehood. Other things were happening, though. 1945, end of the Second World War. Something magnificent happens. And what was that? Countries got together and they said, we have to stop this kind of crap, essentially, that we have observed Germany having done, going through Europe and taking over other recognized nations, invading nations and simply taking over territories. And so we are going to create a new world order, moving away from the League of Nations. We're going to create the United Nations. And in the United Nations, in its very charter, we are saying that one of the principles that we stand by is the right of all peoples to self-determination. And you're showing me the charter of the United Nations. Oh, well, that comes after the the charter. But you see, new social order, a new world order. So that term New World Order didn't start with George Bush. It started back in 1945. People were saying, we've got to stop this idea of nations taking over other nations. And within the charter, they created this Article 73 of the charter, where they said non-self-governing territories must be brought to self-governance. It was part of the decolonization effort of the United Nations. At that time, the United Nations consisted of about 50 countries. Through the decolonization process, they now have about 190 countries, members of the United Nations. It's because of that sweep of decolonization. And the decolonization process was not something that just began in 1945 with the United Nations. It goes all the way back. The American history is so important in the creation of the concept, the international concept of the right of all peoples to self-determination. The American Revolution, that's what the story is all about. It's a great history that the Americans can be proud of and should be proud of. But they should pay attention to what the words say, the right of all peoples to self-determination. And sometimes they tend to change. You know, they limit it. The blacks, no, they're not entitled to it. Leave them slaves. And we can take over other countries because we are the exception to the law that we created. I don't mean to cover all of the, the history of decolonization, but in 1945, they had that article in the Charter of the United Nations, but they didn't name precisely who were the countries who were the colonizers. They left that out. What they did in the next General Assembly, the first General Assembly of the United Nations, they said, okay, now that we have adopted a charter, let's call you folks in and start listing all of these territories that you should bring to self-governance. So the United States, along with Britain, along with France, along with all these other colonizing nations, marched in and started listing, okay, these are the territories that we promise to bring about self-determination. The United States listed 7 specific areas, and I don't remember, I cannot list all 7, I may forget them. But generally, they were Hawaii, Alaska, Samoa, Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Panama Canal Zone, and Marshall Islands. Now, you had 2 types of territories. One was a secured trust territories. So that's what we call the trust territories. And the other was the non-self-governing territories. Okay? So the trust territories, they said, okay, because this is for national security, we are going to treat them under a different category. Hawaii was under the non-self-governing territory list. What the United Nations said was that you are obligated, not only obligated, they call it a sacred trust obligation, to bring about self-determination for these people. And when you bring about self-determination, you must give these people the right to choose for themselves 3 options. 1, to be integrated with the colonial country, or what they call the administering power, or to be in free association with the administering power, Commonwealth, or to be an independent nation. So it is the people who have lost their right to self-determination to exercise one of these 3 purposes. Okay. Very clear law. 1959, 1958. The United States could see that the international community is getting tired of these countries that have not been moving its people to self-determination. So they are about to adopt a resolution, Resolution 1514, that declares that colonization is, in essence, an international crime. And they're going to create a body for decolonization. Today we call it the Special Committee on Decolonization. So the United States decides that they need to get Alaska and Hawaii as a state of the United States so that they won't be facing the awareness of decolonization for these areas. So they decide that we shall put a question to the people of Alaska and to the people of Hawaii. For the people of Alaska, they actually faced an even more strenuous test. The question for Alaska was, shall Alaska be admitted into the Union as a state? Yes or no? The question for Hawaii, shall Hawaii be immediately admitted into the Union as a state? Yes or no? Okay, look at that question. The test was 3 options: statehood or full integration, free association, or independence. From that question, where do you get integration? Shall you be a state or not? That's integration. What happened to free association? No question there. What happened to independence? Not even addressed. The only question was that, shall Hawaii be immediately admitted into the Union as a state? Yes or no? You vote yes, we're part of the state. You vote no, what happens? You remain a territory. You're still integrated. Did they meet the test of self-determination? There was no determination. So the United States actually committed a fraud by the very question that they placed. If only there was an applause rather than a bell ringing. That's a press. Okay, so the next point is, what else happened with that question? Who were permitted to participate in that vote? In Alaska, the U.S. military voted. They were paid to vote, to participate in this choice of self-determination.
That seems fair.
That's so
not fair.
unfair. The indigenous people were generally forbidden from voting. Who are the people who are non-self-governing? It certainly wasn't the American military. They came into territory to vote. In the Hawaii situation, the indigenous people were permitted to vote, but so was the U.S. military. The only requirement was that you had to be a resident of Hawaii for at least 1 year, and you had to be a U.S. citizen. Or in other words, those people who still remembered our history, who had no loyalty to the United States, who could not sign to say, and I continue to take that position, that I am not a U.S. citizen. We had been, and even to the present time, are forbidden from participating in all public elections. Even service on our jury, we cannot serve on our jury. And they promise that you shall have a jury of your peers. But when it comes to the Hawaiian nationals, they X us out. We are forbidden from getting a driver's license because you need to be a U.S. citizen. You cannot get a job unless you are a U.S. citizen or you have permission to be in the United States. How are we supposed to have those qualifications? So what they are doing is they are marginalizing, even today, your people who see ourselves as Hawaiian national. Discrimination all over the place against the Hawaiian nationals. Okay, but that distracts me from the cause. So what happens is in 1959, the United States runs to the United Nations and submits to the General Assembly of the United Nations, saying that the General Assembly must take Hawaii off, as well as Alaska, off of the list of places to be decolonized because the people have voted to be part of the United States. The General Assembly applaud the United States. Congratulations. And so they pulled Hawaii and Alaska off of the list of places to be decolonized. 1959, 1958. So what happens now is, as we approach the United Nations General Assembly, we are saying it doesn't count. How can you say you had a legitimate vote when the vote was committed under a fraudulent exercise? Not only a single fraud, but a double fraud. They manipulated who the self was, and they manipulated the question so that we had no options. Some people say, hey, but wait a minute. You're trying to close the barn door after the horses have run off. And I'm saying, first of all, we are not horses. And secondly, somebody else has also said, let's reopen this question. There's a place called Mauritius, an independent nation. In 1965, I believe, they became independent. It's a nation right along the African coast. And what had happened was that Britain had control over Mauritius as a territory. It's a chain of islands, the Chagos Islands, I think it's called. And what Britain said was that we'll give you your independence on the condition that we will chop up this area. We will take part of these islands and create a military base for national security purposes. Diego Garcia, I think the base is called. And we shall control that base forever. But you folks can be independent. They created a commission. They appointed who were going to sit on the commission. And they said, you have to agree to these terms, or else we'll reappoint new people to be on the commission. The people who were on the commission initially said, well, why don't you take it for 99 years and then give it back to us after that period of time? They said, no, we're not satisfied with it. We're just going to take the whole thing, the whole shebang. Okay. So the people of Mauritius got their independence. Following that, in 1965, they have been continually saying, you know, something happened that was wrong. We were victims of a theft. But the United States, who now received the military base there from the British, And the British said, hey, it's too late. It's been too many years. You cannot reopen a question. Normally in international law, you cannot invade the province of the sovereignty of a nation, especially a member of the United Nations, especially if they have veto power in the Security Council, you know, the big cheese. Yeah, you got to leave them alone. So this is what this Mauritius did. Fantastic idea. The decision just came out a few months ago in February of 2019. The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, said, we're going to take a look at this question to see whether or not the General Assembly met its obligation of self-determination in what it did with regards to approving Mauritius being taken off the list and what happened to these other places. Britain and the US came in and says, wait a minute, we forbid you from doing it. We refuse to concede jurisdiction to the court. The ICJ said, we are not asking you for your consent. We are merely giving advice to the General Assembly on whether or not they met their obligation. This is an opinion that the International Court is giving. And this is what the International Court said. Self-determination has not been completed. And that Mauritius should have all of the territory back in order to complete self-determination. The question has been asked, how is Hawaii going to address this issue before the United Nations? Well, we have a petition. It's calling the international community to take a look at the resolution that was adopted by the General Assembly in 1959. And what we are saying is that a fraud was committed against the General Assembly in the report of the United States to the General Assembly. A fraud committed not only against the General Assembly, but against the people of Hawaii, who had the right to self-determination. And we are asking to reopen that question because the closing of the question was not appropriate. It's never appropriate if there's a fraud committed. You can either go to the ICJ for another opinion, or you can appeal to the General Assembly and ask the General Assembly to reinscribe Hawaii on the list of places to be decolonized. See, previously they took Hawaii off of the list. They have the right to put Hawaii back on the list. Generally, the United States will say, because that is what they have supported France from saying, oh, wait a minute. Previously, you already took these places off. For example, the Society Islands or Tahiti or Kanaki or New Caledonia, taken off by the French. And yet they went right back in, the people of Kanaki or New Caledonia and of Tahiti. And they said, wait a minute, this wasn't justice. A fraud was committed. How can you have all of France voting for us as to whether or not we are integrated into France or not? Open the question up again. France, the United States, Canada, I believe Australia, the major white countries came in and says, nope, we're not going to touch it. We are going to vote against it. But who are the members of the General Assembly? And it is the General Assembly, not the Security Council, that controls this question. So the veto power of the Security Council does not work. It is in the General Assembly. So the General Assembly has said, we are going to reinscribe Tahiti, New Caledonia, onto the list again. Open up the question. In another question with regards to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is in a status of Commonwealth. But they have been saying, hey, wait a minute, we got cheated. They didn't really accept us as a state fully integrated or as an independent nation. These are only advisory questions. We never got self-determination. The United States came in and says, it's already decided. And there was a nation that was actually leading these causes for liberation of these areas. And what nation was that? Cuba. Cuba had a strong voice at the United Nations in the Special Committee on Decolonization. And they led the fight. And a good friend of mine was one of the leaders in that fight. And he was saying, as long as we have a situation of non-exercise of self-determination, the question will always remain open. You can commit all the fraud you want. If you show that it's fraud, it's always subject to be reopened. Okay. So you have legal arguments there to reopen the question at the United Nations. To answer the specific question, what is the legal approach? But that's just legalistic. To move a people, to move a society towards independence, that's only less than half the battle. The battle has to be fought at home. The battle has to be fought with the people who want independence, who want to be able to be a free people again. And the problem is what I call the fear of freedom. Some people sometimes cannot really appreciate the fear of freedom. But many people are afraid of freedom. Previously, I spoke about what happened to the American slaves. Many of them who were against the emancipation because they didn't know what was going to happen. They were afraid. There were going to be a lot of unemployment. They were going to get kicked off of the plantations. They were not going to get free health insurance. I don't know how well insured they were, but there were no more doctors to be sent to the plantation. There was no more employment and all of that stuff. The fear of freedom. If you go down to your U.S. bases and you talk to the people who are what we call lifers, there is a particular fear of becoming civilians. They just don't know what to expect. It is a common part of the human being, the uncertainty of freedom. And yet, on the other side, and I've spoken with some prisoners, and they say there is nothing sweeter than freedom itself. But when you talk about a people and the right of a people to be free, let's not forget those experiences of the battles that the United States or the American colonies had fought to be able to run or lead their own destiny. The right of people to be free. It's such a fundamental right. And I'm not going to push it anymore other than to ask that you go to these international documents. Look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the protocols or the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. You have generations of rights, or human rights. And they always start out with, whereas all nations and all peoples have the right to self-determination. Are these merely words? Or is this something that we can dedicate ourselves to in a full appreciation of what it really means? To be able to guide your own destiny so that the government that is representing you, you have better control over the government instead of the current manipulation where large governments are so controlled by other factors, not necessarily by the people, that they lose the forcefulness of this concept of representative government, of a true democracy, where money speaks louder than people, where the manipulation of votes take over. I'm not saying that as independent nations we would solve all of those problems, but I am suggesting that we have the right to try. we have the right to control our own destiny. If we screw up again, if we screw up, it's our fault. But at least it's our mistake, not someone else who used us to make their mistakes and committed us to wars and that kind of stuff. So I think that's. I'm sorry for the length of the answer to that very short question.
Very good, very good.
What is the plan? Any questions that you folks may have?
Yeah, so what are you doing actually legally? Are you sending to the General Assembly a request to revisit this? I mean, what kind of concrete action are you thinking of taking, or have you taken already?
So the question has been, what are you doing? Or is this only talk? Well, it's only talk, but we're also doing something else. I have some papers, and I recommend that you folks visit my website. It's at hawaiianperspectives.org. And if you go to the documents that deal with the United Nations, you will see one particular document, and it is this call to the General Assembly or to members of the United Nations to review the resolution which was taken. And what we do is it's about 15 pages in which we set out that history, we set out the internal communications within the United States, the plotting and the planning, and how the question was presented to the General Assembly. We also show what the votes were and how the votes were manipulated, so that it wasn't self that exercised determination, but it was a manufactured or manipulated self, an altered self that exercised determination, and why the determination was limited. So we try to set out this as clearly as we can to show that the General Assembly has not met their obligation for self-determination. Then we are following that with a resolution asking the General Assembly very specifically to refer the matter to one of the special committees within the United Nations system. And it's very important to remember, and when people say, the United Nations, they won't do anything because they're controlled by the United States, not so. Previously, we talked about the sweep of decolonization in the world since the formation of the United Nations. The United States and the other veto-powered nation control the Security Council. These issues are contained in the General Assembly. That's where human rights are controlled. So don't just wipe away the United Nations. There are many different alternatives. And I have also shown you how the judicial system within the United Nations, at least it can come out with opinions. What happens with that opinion? When now a person gets arrested in Hawaii and he says, I'm a Hawaiian national, you have no jurisdiction over us. And the U.S. courts will say, well, according to our Supreme Court, this is what it says. And now the members can say, the Supreme Court may say that. But if the United States is a member of the United Nations by treaty, and if Article 6 of the Charter of the Constitution of the United States says that all treaties are part of the law of the land, and every judge is required to abide by the law of the land, then you are actually violating your own obligation to support the U.S. Constitution. Right. So there are many ways to get back to these fundamental principles. But we cannot leave this all to just game playing. That the tactics are to be left with the lawyers. And so I suggest that we follow this principle, that above all law is humanity. Just be humane. Be true. In Hawaii, we say pono. That's part of our motto, our national motto. Follow that instead, and you won't be taken off the appropriate pathway. sorry for deviating and using your question to deviate.
No, I just wanted to know I don't know if you mentioned this, I missed it, the status of, have you already filed that or you're going to?
What we are doing is we are not, because there's no real way we can quote file it at the United Nations. We are not party members of the United Nations, but we can inform other countries. We can go to regional organizations such as the Pacific region or the whatever region that may have an interest and approach them and talk about the injustice that we are facing. And they may face other injustices in other territories. And they may say, because they are products of decolonization, they understand what colonization is. So it's not just jumping right at the United Nations General Assembly and getting an audience, but it's working the crowd, getting different nations, appropriate nations, to go in and contest. Asking the United States, there's meetings every year in Geneva, Switzerland, addressing human rights issue. Go through the door of human rights and say that there are continuing violations in our territory. You're taking our language, you're denying our history. All of these things, raise it over and over and over again. Build coalition, not only for the sake of independence, but for the sake of friendship, support other people in terms of their human rights causes. And then what you will find is a network going on, non-governmental organizations, they call it NGO in the international arena. Associate with them. Churches are very concerned about this kind of stuff. There's a particular church, I forget the name of it. They recognize Hawaii as an independent nation and always did from the very beginning. So you need to start tying up these kinds of stuff. And many of the Christian churches and even the Islamic churches, they recognize the injustices that have been done, and they are stepping up and they are giving support. Build a network, not only the legalistic network, but the network of human rights people and all of those things, and just keep pushing and pushing and pushing.
You guys have any questions?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Oh, no, go ahead.
Well, just the opening remark that we stepped into some pretty, giant historical footsteps here. At the end of the First World War, when they were debating about forming the League of Nations, there was a Paris Peace Conference at which everybody who could make it to Paris was invited to bring a map of their national territories. They're dividing up these empires. Okay, and so the Armenians brought theirs, the Georgians brought theirs, the Kurds brought theirs, the Arabs brought theirs, the Koreans, the Vietnamese, the Irish, all brought their maps and said, this is our national territory. Okay. Some of them, all of them had to fight for their national territory. India, that we are a country called India. Okay, and then you get into the mishmash that had been done to Africa by the Conference of Berlin. But eventually, most of them managed to win their national self-determination, but at a price over and over again that was paid, and that was the price of divvying up their country. This happened to India, this happened to Palestine, this happened to Ireland, of course. After the end of the Second World War, this happened to Korea, where instead of one country, you had two or four in the case of Kyrgyzstan. Okay, and they're the largest country that submitted a map in Paris at the end of the First World War that was swallowed up by its neighbors, by Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, which themselves were divided by Britain and France, and Iran, which, was the part that had never been part of the Ottoman Empire. So they submitted a map, okay, here's Kurdistan, here's where the Kurds live, and the Assyrians go, wait a second, what about us? Make a map. But it was a big push for decolonization at the end of the First World War that didn't happen right then, but over the course of struggle happened in many, many countries. And like I say, unfortunately, in places like Palestine, India, Ireland, Korea, they were divided. Kurdistan to this day is divided between its four neighbors. Okay. Now, in the case of California, it's kind of interesting. First of all, we were built over the bones of many, 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 many indigenous nations. We're more like Switzerland in that regard. You were saying that Hawaii had some legal commonality with Switzerland. Your literacy rate was second only to Switzerland. They got 4 languages to worry about. You only got 1. But California, as Hannah that pointed me up to this, a very interesting thing happened during the process of our annexation. It came in 2 phases. The first phases was that our defending forces were defeated by the United States in the field of battle, and an armistice was signed between the California defenders and the U.S. attackers, in which they agreed not to fight anymore. Okay. That at that point, the future political status of California was yet to be determined. And then came the defeat of the Mexican forces and the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And that treaty specified that California, Alta California, which was broken up, by the way, post that. That's why there's a Nevada and a Utah and some of those other states that were split off from us the way Baja Sur was from Baja on the other side. Okay, we were admitted as a non-self-governing territory under the terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo signed between the U.S. and Mexican federal governments. Well, wait a second. We never signed on to that. We were not under control of the Mexican federal government and hadn't been under direct control since 1836. They kept trying to impose it. We kept fighting them off. So we were already autonomous. And the analogy that has been made is Taiwan. What if China were to sign a treaty, say, in the run-up to the Second World War, something like that, ceding Taiwan to Japan or something like that? So what if they were to cede Taiwan to some other nation other than themselves, to China? And it's like, well, wait a second. You're not governing us at this point. We're self-determining. So you got no right to sign over our status when we don't agree to it. Okay. There's no way that China could legally cede Taiwan to anybody because they don't control it. Okay. They have de jure jurisdiction, but not de facto control. And there is, they've been de facto independent since 1949. California was in the same position from 1836 onward. Okay, de jure we were part of and we were still a non-self-governing territory. But de facto, we were independent since 1836. So when we were ceded to the United States, the Mexican government had no control over us at that time. We had already signed an armistice. Okay, ourselves. And that totally, that's just between, the governments of the territory. That doesn't include the fact, did anybody ask the indigenous people here what they signed on? I don't think so. Okay. So, there's so much we have to learn from you.
Yeah.
So much.
There's definitely parallels.
Yeah.
Of course.
We step in the footsteps of giants.
Yeah.
Step in the footsteps of giants. He's looking behind him.
Okay.
have a question?
Yeah. So, my question is, you were talking about Hawaii sovereignty, and America comes in with the military. They take over Hawaii. It's basically independent, and then they say, "Oh, we have a vote," but a lot of Hawaiians don't get a vote. Like you said, if they didn't swear this loyalty oath or whatever, so a lot of the people who are there don't get a vote. And then they have the military officers do get a vote.
Not only officers, all military.
So they say, okay, indigenous people of this area, a bunch of you don't get a vote. We're going to transport in people who have American values and loyalty to America, have them be there maybe a year max, and then they get a vote. And that seems to be the basis for you saying that the vote to become a state or join America that was recognized by the UN back in the 50s was illegitimate. So, in California, we were independent from Mexico at that time. And the American military comes in and takes it over. And then says basically all the Mexicans, Asians, free black men, and indigenous, you don't get a vote. I think about 20, maybe 100 rich Californians did, but thousands of other people of the area didn't get a vote. And then they built the Transcontinental Railroad, and they piped in a bunch of people from the East Coast who had been here no more than 2 years. And they held a vote, and they go, okay, so all the ethnic people, you don't get a vote, basically. And then we had all these people who come in from America, and they get a vote, and we say it's legal. What I'm hearing is a similar legal justification for California suing the federal government for not being made a state legally that you're using for Hawaii. Am I way off, or are there parallels?
There are parallels. First, let me say, I'm not familiar with the California history
Sure.
as I am of Hawaii. So, just hearing what you have spoken about, be very careful when you use the specific terms of non-self-governing territories, because that occurred in 1945, 1946, and onward. So those are a term of art used in the international community that applies to those areas. Now, with regards to California, you're talking about maybe 100 years before that.
Right.
The principle, the underlying principle is the same.
That's what I'm asking.
And what you're really talking about is this tool called transmigration. Let me give you an example, and I'm going to tell you a story. It may seem like a deviation from our underlying story. This occurs in Kanaki, and I hear it from a person, Jan Urage, one of the leaders for the independence movement. He has passed away, but he tells me, you know, Poka, the culture of our people is that we are very friendly and we like to show people how our hospitality. So in the village in town that he belongs to, there's a Kanak, a person of Kanaki. He's sitting on his porch one day and he watches and he sees a person walking down the footpath. It's a Frenchman, or they call him, I think, Caldoche. He's walking on the footpath past his home. So the Kanak stands up and invites the Frenchman into his home to take refreshments. So the Frenchman walks in and the Kanak shows him his table and says, come and I want to provide you with refreshments. The Frenchman sits down at the table. The Kanak goes ahead and provides him with refreshment. When the Frenchman is done, he gets up and he offers to pay the Kanak. And the Kanak says, no, I just invited you because I wanted to express to you our hospitality, our culture. So the Frenchman is happy because he's got a free meal. The Kanak is happy because he was able to express his culture. The next day, the Frenchman or the Kanak is not out on the porch. The Frenchman comes walking down the footpath again. But this time he brings two of his friends. And seeing that there's no one in the porch waiting to invite them, and rather than standing on ceremony, he invites himself and his friends into the Kanak's house. Now, it's just a Kanak and his wife who lives in this house. The Kanak is now going from his field, walking into the home, and he sees three Frenchmen sitting at the table. And he says, oh my, what an interesting custom they have to invite themselves in. But that's okay. They are strangers, and I'm obligated to show my hospitality. So he goes ahead and he provides food and drink to these guests. After they take the food and drink, They sit around and they talk about, oh, what a wonderful house this is. It doesn't have screens on the windows so that the wind just blows right in. And it's nice and comfortable here in this home. And after a while, they get up and they address the Kanak. They say, you have a wonderful house. We like this house. And we're wondering if you could show us where you and your wife sleeps. Where's your bedroom? And the Kanak thinks it's kind of curious behavior to be asking these things of a family. But he says, for the sake of friendliness and good sportsmanship, I'll show you where my wife and I sleep. So he takes them to the back of the house and shows a special room. And he says, this is the bedroom for my wife and myself. One Frenchman steps forward and says, we like this room. We want to move in. Now that's kind of pushing it a little bit too much. So the Kanak is getting angry and he says, wait a minute. What do you mean you want to move in? If you move in, where will my wife and I move to? So you folks can go into the kitchen, or maybe even better, go out on the porch. Now that's an insult. So the Kanak is there ready to fight with his Frenchman. One Frenchman steps up and says, wait a minute, let's not be savage. Let's not be uncivilized. Let's act as civilized people. Let's be democratic. Let's take a vote.
Three against.
And that's a proportion that has been going on in Kanaki. But the idea is transmigration. How a people first take over a territory, bring their people in, and then try to use the excuse of democracy where there is no righteousness, there is no pono, there is no appropriateness. And they steal using these tools. Whether it occurs in California, or in Hawaii, or in Kanaki, or in any of these other places, that's one of the things that people under colonization need to be very careful of. Allowing this concept of democracy, a misguided concept, to steal. So somehow we got to pierce through this kind of charade that goes on and on and on and see past that. Each area must see for themselves what their history is and pierce through those things to get to the truth of it and communicate it to your people, to organize your people.
And so I have one, I don't know if it's a final question, but just an important one that came up because you were talking about that, and you just said that again, for Californians, Hawaiians, there's that fear of freedom, right? Californians probably have it also, a lot of Californians do. What's going to happen to us? The United States military is not going to be there. We're going to be taken over or whatever. There's all kinds of arguments we get of the fear of that freedom of California. And you mentioned that for Hawaiians as well. What is your take and what is your perception of the general opinion of Hawaiians on independent California? Is there is there a higher percentage that do want it, or there's a higher percentage that have that fear of the freedom, as you say?
In Hawaii, I don't think the question was, how do we deal with the fear of freedom in Hawaii?
Yeah.
And I don't think that's such a major problem because we have been talking about the sovereignty movement for many years. I think the fear or the uncertainty is who's going to lead and where are you going to lead us to? How do you organize? We have so much disagreement among our own people. Part of the argument is, on one hand, people want total independence. They want to establish a kingdom. So questions are, and who in the world is going to be the king? Who's the queen? What is the Constitution? Do we have the right to participate? Or has it already been decided by a party that you just held 2 weeks ago and we weren't invited to the birthday? There is a lot of uncertainty. On the other hand, people are saying, no, we cannot be an independent nation because we're not ready for it. Instead, let us just accept federal recognition so that we will be treated as indigenous people like an Indian tribe and get federal recognition and get all the goodies that